pleased to have with me in the studio Mike Lofgren, former congressional staff member who served on both the House and Senate budget committees. His book about Congress was titled The Party Is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy and Democrats Became Useless and the Middle Class Got Shafted. It appeared in paperback back in 2013. His latest book is called Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of the Shadow Government. Mike, welcome to the program.
Good to be here, Tom.
I'm glad to have you with us. Before we get into the deep state, I'd like to just get your final thoughts on The Party Is Over. How did the Republicans go crazy and the Democrats become useless and the middle class get shafted, and is that still very much the reality?
Well, it's very much the reality. The Democrats are a conflicted status quo party. It's dependent on big corporate donations, just like the Republicans. But they try to pretend to be the party of the people, so that gives their ultimate confliction and why they can't come out swinging in elections.
Unless they're Bernie Sanders or member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
Right. Unless they have nothing to lose, they've got a different business model for raising money, as Bernie Sanders has.
Right.
You know, his average contribution is something like less than $30. Now, the Republicans, I've determined, have become kind of a apocalyptic cult run by authoritarians, and most of the base seems to be authoritarian followers. Now, when I did that, it was accurate. It's still accurate, but I wasn't completely satisfied because there's a kind of internal GPS in this country now that's grown up over the last few decades that keeps both parties on pretty much the same path. There's nuanced differences, but in the big issues of Wall Street dominance, who gets what in our society, war, surveillance, beyond a few nuances, the parties are pretty much the same. Now, they may have genuine fights over abortion, gay rights, gay marriage, and other social issues. And that's not to say those aren't important, but they aren't the issues that involve cash flow. Right. And cash flow is what we're talking about.
So this is why no banksters went to jail under Obama or Bush. Although banksters did go to jail under the Reagan administration. When he deregulated the S&Ls in 83 and then they crashed in 87, he went after them. And over 100 of them went to jail, as I recall.
That's right. Under the Resolution Trust Corporation, after the S&L crash,
right.
They did go to jail.
Yeah.
However, it's an entirely different situation. And one of the things that strikes me is that under the sort of deep state governance, we have pretty much the same people surrounding the president, no matter who he is. Now, we have George W. Bush, Iraq, the surge, and we have Barack Obama, progressive Democrat or self-described, in 2008, who was against Iraq, wanted to withdraw. Who ends up being the Secretary of Defense for both of them? Bob Gates, an old Bush family consigliere. Mm-hmm. He presided over the surge, and he convinced and presided over the surge for Obama in Afghanistan in 2009. In terms of Wall Street, you've got Tim Geithner for Obama. You've got Hank Paulson for George W. Bush. They were birds of a feather. They were both creatures of Wall Street.
Of Goldman Sachs, in fact, weren't they?
I don't know about Geithner. His most recent job had been president of the New York Fed, which certainly put him well into that milieu. But certainly Paulson was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Mm-hmm. And they pretty much followed the same policies as far as the bailout, which means essentially no limits on compensation, no cleaning house, no strings attached, no too big to fail.
No structural changes.
Exactly.
Yeah, essentially. So where are we at? I mean, I wrote a book called The Crash of 2016, pointing out many of these same things and suggesting that we could track a lot of the origin of this back to 1971, the Powell Memo, 1976, the Buckley case, which Lewis Powell authored, that said, the up until 1976, the spending of money to influence politics was considered a behavior. Since 1976, it's been considered a constitutionally protected action.
Buckley versus Vallejo.
Yeah, Buckley v. Vallejo, 1976. And then the so-called Reagan Revolution, the idea that government is bad, greed is good. If we just turn everything over to the so-called marketplace, everything will get much more efficient. Are those milestones in your thinking?
They're not only in my thinking, they're in my book. I discuss the Powell Memo at length, how think tanks like Cato and the Heritage Foundation were set up right around that time in the early 1970s, and they became sort of propaganda megaphones for things like F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, and neoliberal economic policies. Mm-hmm. Now, why is it called neoliberal and the foreign policy called neoconservative? They both tend to be the same thing. It's just happenstance of historical evolution. A liberal, where neoliberal comes from in Europe, is an entirely different thing from what we consider a liberal in the United States.
Yeah, in Europe, a liberal would be considered a libertarian here.
That is correct.
Yeah. And whereas in Europe they would refer to progressives as basically the Labor Party sort of thing, or the left, or
social democrat.
Yeah, democratic socialists. Yeah, mm-hmm. Exactly, social democrats. So where are we at right at this moment in history, and what does that tell us about where we're probably going?
Well, I had thought as I wrote this book that we were so entrenched with this oligarchy, that they had so much money to co-opt people, so much firepower, so much surveillance, that it was unclear how long they could continue to stumble along. Now, it's a very wasteful and incompetent method of government. They couldn't predict or deal with the crash of 2008. We've had 3 in a row failures with Iraq, Libya, and Syria. They even failed to predict the obvious possibility that New Orleans could be inundated in a hurricane.
Right.
Nevertheless, I thought this was pretty much an entrenched system. Now I'm beginning to wonder, because you certainly can't compare their ideologies, but with Donald Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left, they have new business models that, don't kid yourself, are scaring the daylights out of the party oligarchies. Because Trump, who is the self-proclaimed person who's richer than God and doesn't need the money of the typical billionaire contributor, there's a certain group of people in this country. They may be misinformed, they may be misguided, but they know something is wrong, and that appeals to them.
Sure.
Whereas Sanders, as we've discussed, his business model is entirely different. Rather than trolling among the billionaire class, he's got tens of thousands of self-energized enthusiasts out there,
millions,
who are raising money. And in fact, the average contribution, last I checked, it was a Washington Post story in mid-December, was less than $30. So he destroys that business model.
Mike, stick around. We're talking with Mike Lofgren, New York Times bestselling author of The Party Is Over, his new book, The Deep State. We'll be right back. So, Mike, let's define terms here. Deep state.
Well, the deep state is what I define as a hybrid association of elements of government, mainly in the national security field and the financial field, like the Department of the Treasury, and top-level finance, the military-industrial complex, and last but certainly not least, because they're generating so much money, Silicon Valley. A former national security agency insider once told me they could not even approach doing what they consider their mission without the cooperation of Silicon Valley. And 70% of contracts, roughly, or 70% of the budget of the NSA consists of contracts. It's outsourced to companies like Booz Allen, which is 99% dependent on government contracts.
Booz Allen is the company that Ed Snowden worked for.
That's right. And all those people, like NSA Director Alexander, who wanted to boil him in oil over those leaks, well, how did a lowly contractor personnel, how did he get a hold of all those secrets to begin with? It's because they basically outsourced the essential business of government. And believe me, surveillance is something that the government ought to be doing it if it's doing it at all for the sake of national security, and it ought to be done under very strict guidelines, observing the Fourth Amendment for American citizens.
Right.
That said, if it should be done, it should be done by the government. You cannot put that kind of burden of responsibility on people who are making a profit out of it.
Or that kind of power, I mean,
yes,
for that matter. Booz Allen does not have to honor the Fourth Amendment, whereas the federal government does.
That's right. And Booz Allen is, I believe, the either majority or the plurality shareholder of Booz Allen is the Carlyle Group. And, you know, they have really
Sheikh
more
Talal
money than God.
Used to be one of the
That's right.
The
and
Saudis.
So we complete the circle: the military-industrial complex, Silicon Valley, Wall Street.
Wow. So what does this? Well, this is pretty tightly nailed down stuff. Then, I mean, did this begin in the Reagan administration? This rush to privatization of government functions? It's certainly consistent with their ideology.
Since the Second World War, we've had something approaching a deep state insofar as the Manhattan Project, which involved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people living in secret towns like Hanford and Oak Ridge. We had the cryptography for the magic and the Enigma decoding, which meant tens of thousands of people who kept secrets for the rest of their life after the war. The problem was the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration. We had people like Cheney as Secretary of Defense. He undertook a very broad outsourcing of logistics. In other words, the Army cannot feed itself now. The Army cannot go to war now without private contractors like Halliburton, of which he was CEO and from whom he received deferred compensation as he was vice president as we were invading Iraq.
Mike Lofgren in the studio with us. He's a former congressional staff member who served in both the House and Senate budget committees. His last book, The Party Is Over, his new book is called The Deep State. We were just talking about the deep state, and you were describing how the 70% of the NSA budget has now been outsourced to private corporations who don't have to operate within the constraints of the Fourth Amendment, unlike the government. And how Dick Cheney, when he was in the Reagan administration, do I have that right? Or was
it was under the first Bush administration?
The first Bush administration was pushing heavily to basically privatize large chunks of our government functions, especially in the military. And now our military can no longer feed themselves. They can't even go to war by themselves without a private for-profit corporation having not necessarily just their hand in this. I mean, Halliburton was about to go bankrupt in 2000 when Dick Cheney became vice president because they'd acquired Dresser Industries and they had this huge asbestos liability. And now Halliburton is, in fact, didn't they move their headquarters to Dubai or something? Or am I thinking of Blackwater?
That could have been Blackwater.
Yeah, it probably was. So has the corporate sector so insinuated itself into virtually every part of our government, whether it's charter schools in the Department of Education or, Booz Allen and all, and this is not to pick on them, there's hundreds of them in the Department of Defense or the NSA or whatever. Have they inserted themselves so deeply That the prospect of unwinding this thing that Dwight Eisenhower warned us about is no longer possible?
Well, let's put it this way. It would be very difficult. If you were to walk into the Pentagon, you'd see huge numbers of contractors there sitting at desks in the Pentagon. It's the same thing for the intelligence analysis functions in Homeland Security. There's an awful lot of contractors there. It's throughout the government now. It's being outsourced. Department of Energy, which involves nuclear waste and nuclear weapons. The Department of Energy is almost a shell, and it is being totally run by the contractors. There's been a lot of whistleblower activity out in Hanford, Washington, because the plutonium there threatens to leak and get into the Columbia River. And yet these whistleblowers are constantly harassed and punished, and there's no real oversight going on in Washington.
So, wow, Benito Mussolini described fascism as the merger of corporate and state interests. Merriam-Webster added, and belligerent nationalism. Depending on who we have selected as president, I think all three of those criteria would be met, particularly with like a Ted Cruz presidency or a Donald Trump. How do we extract ourselves from this?
Well, I think before we act and before the public acts, they really need to inform themselves about what's going on. Now, for most of the commercial media, it's not in their interest to do that. During the Reagan administration, there were probably 50 to 60 large or relatively large corporations that constituted the commercial media. Now, the bulk of the media is reduced to about 6 corporations. And talking about where your money goes and following the money through the NSA to the contractors is a complicated story, and it doesn't necessarily sell cornflakes and Budweiser.
Mm-hmm. Whereas Kim Kardashian does.
Kim Kardashian, whether Tom Brady deflated a football, this is the kind of story that they like to give to the public. And the public, well, we assume that that's what they want to consume because that's all there is. And I think the first step for the public is to find out where their tax money is going.
Mm-hmm. In your new book, Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government, are you suggesting that there is, I guess I'm asking the same question maybe in a different way, is there a solution to this? You said it would be difficult. What would be involved? And is for example, the Bernie Sanders revolution, President Obama a couple of years ago acknowledged that Reagan, he said he was a consequential president, that it was a real, genuine revolution. America changed dramatically as a result of the Reagan presidency, basically abandoning much of the New Deal principles. We went from, John Maynard Keynes to Friedrich Hayek. Is it possible that a Sanders presidency could change that, or any presidency? I mean, if you don't want to get involved in speculating about partisan politics, what's it going to take?
There's all kinds of great reforms one could undertake as far as corporate governance, regulating Wall Street, consolidating our military, and withdrawing from the Middle East militarily, which I believe we have to do because our record is one of unblemished failure. But nothing will happen unless we get the money out of politics. And perhaps Sanders is making a first step in that direction, because unless you align the incentives of politicians with the people who elect them rather than billionaire donors, it's going to be the same thing.
Yeah, which takes us back to that study out of Princeton about a year ago that suggested that the probability of legislation passing that billionaires want is around 50 or 60%. The probability of legislation passing that the average American wants is statistically equivalent to random noise.
That's right. It's zero unless it just happens to coincide with what the billionaires want.
Right.
That's Gillens
yeah.
and Page from Princeton and Northwestern did that. And they said basically the public has no input.
Right. And thus no power. And,
right.
And that's where the political revolution comes from. The new book, The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government by Mike Lofgren. Mike, a brilliant piece of work. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Glad to be here.
Great to meet you. Mike's website is mikelofgren.net, mikelofgren.net. And the book, of course, The Deep State, available in all your normal places. To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.